Welcome, and thank you all for joining us tonight at the Levy Forum. And once again, I want to thank Paul and Karen Levy for hosting this magnificent series here at Palm Beach Synagogue. I would also like to thank my dear friend Michael Poliakoff from ACTA for co-sponsoring tonight's event. Thank you very much for the wonderful work that ACTA does each and every day on university campuses. I usually begin with a joke, but tonight I decided not to do that for two reasons. The first reason is because tonight's topic is a very serious topic. Who brought anti-Semitism back to America? And we look very much forward to hearing the professor's remarks and insights into our current state of affairs here in the United States of America. But the second reason is because our hearts and our minds are with our fellow Americans in California as they were fighting the devastating fires. And I would like to begin this evening with a prayer for the people in the state of California. Ribbono Shel Olam, Master of the Universe, protect those that are impacted by the devastating Southern California fires. Guide them towards shelter and safety. As family, friends, neighbors, and fellow Californians experience physical and emotional loss, may we turn towards each other with open homes and open hearts. God, spread a blanket of security over the firefighters and first responders that are serving the residents of California. Grant them strength and courage, and may each one come home safely to those they love. Let us be reminded of how to help one another. Holy One of blessing, give us increased compassion and an abundance of kindness, that we may extend our hands and hearts to those in need. As the prophet Elijah experienced, there was a great and mighty wind, splitting mountains and shattering rocks by God's power. But God was not in the wind. After the wind, an earthquake. But God was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake, fire. But God was not in the fire. And after the fire, a small, still voice. God's small, still voice runs through each one of us. May God's voice compel us to reach out to each other and find pathways that lead to hope and ultimately peace for all those in need. And let us respond, Amen. It's now my honor to introduce the founder of tonight's series, dear friend, Mr. Paul Levy.
Thanks very much, Rabbi, and thanks everybody for coming. I'm so delighted to have a full house. It's a testament, Ruth, to the importance of your work product and scholarship over many, many years, so we look forward to hearing you. A few things. Number one, our next event will be on February 10th. I'm very excited about it, and I hope as many of you come as possible, because Bernard-Henri Levy, who was here last year, will be interviewing Natan Sharansky, and he's making the trip, and I hope, I'm sure it'll meet all of our expectations, so I'm really excited about that. The other thing I'd like to do is my usual request that we will have questions. Professor Wisse likes them. She'll be speaking for about 40 minutes. And in order to field as many of them as possible, please don't make a lecture or a sermon and just get to the question. Keep it short. One question per person, and we'll try to get as many people attended to as possible. That's it. You're here not to hear from me, but from Professor Wisse, so please, Michael will introduce her. And I must say, I get credit for these events, but they wouldn't be happening if it weren't for the efforts of Michael and his team. So thank you very much.
Having the opportunity to have with us tonight Professor Ruth Wisse is one of many reasons that I am so enormously grateful to Paul and Karen Levy, who have inspired and who have supported this series, now in its third season. And may it continue for a great time. And my thanks to Rabbi Scheiner and Rabbi Minsky for being such wonderful hosts. Rabbi Scheiner, I remember you once saying you would make the Palm Beach Synagogue the intellectual hub of Palm Beach, and so it is. And it's a sanctuary for both the soul and for the mind. This is a wonderful, wonderful place. The American Council of Trustees and Alumni, otherwise known by its acronym ACTA, is very privileged to have Paul's leadership as a member of its board of directors. He is committed to strengthening this nation through education and has done that all the way from K-12 through higher education. Through Paul's leadership and generosity, ACTA worked to bring Bernard-Henri Levy to 14 campuses in the United States and Canada, helping students gain the knowledge and power to push back against the noisome anti-Semitism that is so often there, and to put copies of his wonderful book, Israel Alone, into the hands of thousands of college students, giving them the ammunition to fight back against the lies and the misrepresentations of Israel and Judaism that are so often there. And I want to give a special thanks to all of those here tonight whose donations have funded ACTA's work as we continue our campus religious freedom project. I particularly want to acknowledge Charles and Rita Bronfman, Alan Schuch and Leslie Himmel, Roger and Susan Hertog, Bill Hyman and Wendy Dietz, David and Simone Levinson, Saul and Joel Busai, Bruce and Susie Kovner, Paul Singer and Terry Castle, and Spencer and Myrna Partridge. Thank you for making this crucial initiative possible. And a special thanks to my colleagues, Emily J., Claire Doyle, and Tracy Pang, who worked tirelessly on the details of these programs as we organize the Levy Forum. And now the honor of introducing Dr. Ruth Wisse, a pioneer in the study and teaching of Yiddish literature and Jewish culture. She is the Martin Peretz Professor of Yiddish Literature and Professor of Comparative Literature at Harvard as an Emerita. She has taught at McGill, at Stanford, at New York University, Hebrew University, and Tel Aviv University. She has given us 7 books and many essays that span a great range of topics in Jewish and American life and culture. Jewish humor, the Shlemiel, liberalism's betrayal of the Jews, marriage and family, and an unwavering defense of Zionism. Dr. Wisse is the Distinguished Senior Fellow at the Tikvah Fund, where she delivered very recently an extraordinary address at the opening of that conference, How the Jews Remain an Eternal People. And I'm just going to quote a couple of sentences from it. As a people, we are done with running. Migration is no longer a national option. And tonight, she is going to explore the fault lines that have brought a virulent anti-Semitism back to the land that was the refuge of our parents, of our grandparents, and our great-grandparents. A hallmark of Dr. Wisse's work is unhesitating and fierce combat against the progressive shibboleths that attempt to mask the vicious agenda that became so clear to us on October 7, October 8, and thereafter. And I'd like to ask everybody to think why we are here tonight and how fortunate we are indeed to have the penetrating wisdom of Dr. Wisse to guide us forward. Dr. Wisse.
This is obviously quite overwhelming. I'm so grateful to very many people who are here, including my daughter and so many benefactors and friends and people from Montreal who who are now either living here or who spend a lot of time here. I feel that I know all of you and wish I could. It is amazing to be here in particular, and I'm very moved because I think that what you have done here is to take a resort and to turn it into a community. And this is the greatest thing that one can do, is to create a community. We're told that this is one of the great problems of life in America, where you have maximal freedom to move, but creating this kind of community is quite exceptional. And all the people who have managed to, to contribute to it, thank you, are certainly to be credited, and I think that includes everybody who is here. Well, just one other note, I'm very grateful for the prayer, because believe it or not, one of the buildings that was burned in Los Angeles now was the day school that my grandchildren in California attended as part of the synagogue there. That is terrifying and frightening, and since we're all here worried about Israel, it is so terrifying and ironic that we should have fires within our midst as well. Well, I was speaking to my teenage granddaughter one day about when my husband and I were her age, and I said offhandedly, Jews used to be quite popular in America. Really, she said? She was so surprised, as if I had said that New York was once a province of China. So in speaking about anti-Semitism, I thought we should begin with the quarter century after the Second World War, when the cultural tide and the public opinion ran strongly for the Jews and against those at home and abroad who were discriminating and acting against them. If we know why anti-Semitism was once in retreat, we have a better chance of understanding how it returned and who helped it back. And that's part of my subject. So the most obvious reason for the unpopularity of anti-Semitism after the Second World War was, of course, the Allied victory over Hitler and Nazism, the mass murderers of the Jewish people. In the 1920s and 1930s, Germany and German Americans had actively promoted fascism in America and gained sympathizers among local nativists who were afraid that Jews were taking over the country, and among isolationists who were afraid that Jews were dragging us to another world war. But America did enter the war in December of 1941, and in April 1945, when the newsreels showed Americans liberating the Bergen-Belsen death camp, the country felt proud of having rescued Europe and the Jews from this horror. Maybe there was even a little guilt and sorrow at having done it too late. Fascism never recovered the limited popularity it had enjoyed before the war, and the fascist uniform and the swastika have remained the main symbol of evil in America ever since. If you want to portray villainy, that's how you portray it. And I think that that's also part of the reason why American Jews invested so much and so readily in commemorating the Holocaust as the epitome of evil. It is comforting to show America and the Jews aligned in the same struggle from which the Jews emerged martyred and the Americans victorious. And a second reason for Jewish popularity after the Second World War was the establishment of Israel in 1948. If there is such a thing as world history, it has no parallel to the nation that lost 1/3 of its people and within 3 years recovered its political sovereignty in the homeland that had been under foreign occupation for 2,000 years. Americans admired the grit of the Jews in standing up to the British and defeating the Arabs, and not least, they appreciated that Israel's law of return and the policy of ingathering exiles and ingathering the most damaged people in the war, freed America of worry from having to absorb all those refugees. So I think that also many Americans saw the plucky Israelis as versions of themselves. America had also gained its independence standing up to the British. We can get the flavor of those years by looking again at Exodus. That's Leon Uris's best-selling novel of 1958, turned into the blockbuster movie starring Paul Newman. Situating the story in 1947 in the Jewish struggle for Palestine, Uris had his eye on the American market, led by, but not limited to, the Jewish book-buying public. The main plot, if you remember, was simple. Kitty Freeman, a nurse as American as cherry pie, who doesn't really like the Jews. She's widowed by her husband's death. She's encouraged to get over it by going to work with refugees in Palestine. And once there, her growing understanding of the Jewish situation overcomes her suspicion of the Jews. And as she changes her attitude, the reader's sympathies move with her. So she grows to admire and love the new Jew, the kibbutz-born farmer, soldier, hero who helps to defy the British blockade and bring in a shipload of European refugees. And she wants to adopt a refugee child, survivor of Germany, from that ship. Bestsellers, as you know, tap into public sentiment, and in those years, respect for Jewish strength combined with sympathy for Jewish suffering. Attitudes towards the Jews, I think, are always part of something larger that the German language calls the Zeitgeist, the defining spirit or mood of the time. And the American spirit in the late 1950s and 1960s was strongly liberal. The greatest stain on the American conscience, the legacy of slavery, was finally being addressed in the mass civil rights movement that really resulted in the Civil Rights Acts and in their implementation, slowly but surely. In that same liberal framework, Jews and Gentiles determined to get rid of any vestiges of anti-Semitism. Israel's victory over the combined Arab armies in June 1967 recast the Jews as winners. And I think that it's good that we should remember, Jews don't tend to remember, that people like winners. During that time, some of us determined to introduce Jewish studies into the university, and we found ourselves pushing on an open door. The Association for Jewish Studies was founded in 1969, which was the same year that I talked my university into letting me teach Yiddish literature. America felt that it had defeated evil in Europe and that it was finally living up to its promise. So in the quarter century, 1948 to 1975, anti-Jewish hostility had no place in America. What's now being called the Jewish Golden Age was also the golden age of pro-American liberalism. But here I want to back up a little bit and look at a part of popular culture that was also against anti-Semitism, but not in the spirit of Exodus, not for Israel or Judaism. Right after the war, when the Soviet Union was also at the height of its popularity, the novel Gentleman's Agreement by Laura Hobson topped the New York Times bestseller list for 14 weeks and was instantly adopted for a film starring Gregory Peck that won the Academy Award as Best Motion Picture for the year 1947. The story featured a Gentile reporter, Philip Green, who is assigned to write about the problem of anti-Semitism. He has the idea, very smart idea, of passing himself off as a Jew so that he can write about the experience of discrimination from the inside. A widower with a son, his romantic interest is also an all-American Kathy, who is exactly like Leon Uris's Kitty, who also feels uncomfortable around the Jews. Now, Green's experiences are what you would pretty much imagine. He goes to a hotel and he is not allowed in when they find out that he's a Jew. His son is beaten up by kids who think that he's a Jew, and his Jewish veteran friend can't find a place to rent. And there's a kind of gentleman's agreement of never mentioning discrimination in polite society. So Green exposes this intolerance in great reportage, and Kathy ends by becoming Phil's ally in the fight. Sounds wonderful, doesn't it? And there are other works just like it. In 1945, before he wrote Death of a Salesman, Arthur Miller published a novel called Focus, which exposes anti-Semitism from a similar angle. A mild-mannered American Gentile named Newman finds that he needs glasses. This was obviously before contact lenses, the premise of this, right? And these glasses make him look like a Jew. And so suddenly, because he's mistaken for a Jew, he is exposed to the anti-Jewish hostility that he once ignored. And like Phil Green, he begins to identify with Jews and ends by standing up against the wicked anti-Semites. Now, you might assume that if a book is against anti-Semitism, it must be for the Jews, but in the branch of popular culture that I am talking about here, you would be mistaken. So the spokesman for the Jews in Gentleman's Agreement is a professor scientist named Joe Lieberman, quite unlike our dear late Senator Lieberman. When Phil Green wants to ask him about Palestine and Zionism, the professor says he's ready to talk about Palestine as a place of refuge, but not about Zionism as a movement for the Jewish state. And he says, if we agree that there's confusion, we can talk, but I really can't talk to a positive Zionist any more than to a confirmed communist. There is no language. Zionism is so hateful that the Jewish professor will not even talk to anyone who believes in a Jewish state. And later in the book, the professor explains that he is against both Jewish nationalism and religion, and he would stop being a Jew altogether if it were not that anti-Semitism makes him afraid to look like a coward. The novel defends people who happen to be Jews only as long as they are not distinctive as a sovereign people. This work against fascist-style anti-Semitism was also against the Jews as a sovereign nation in Israel and as a distinctive religious group in America. And the Arthur Miller novel is even more explicit. The Jewish Jew in this book is a candy store owner named Finkelstein, the target of local anti-Semites. Although he doesn't otherwise figure in the book at all, Miller gives him a whole chapter to himself. Finkelstein decides to visit his father's grave, where he suddenly remembers the story of a Jew named Itzik, the middleman peddler between the Polish lord, the Polish baron, and his Polish peasants. The baron or lord lets Itzik accumulate a bag of money, selling to the dumb peasants who don't know the value of the coins that they pay him. But soon the peasants rise in a pogrom, and when they have killed Itzik's family and neighbors, the baron returns to seize the bag of money, and Itzik goes mad. As Finkelstein rides the subway home, he figures out what the meaning of this story was, and I quote, "It was the pogrom that was inevitable, but not the outcome. Its outcome only seemed inevitable because the money was in the house as the horses' hoofs came pounding into the village. That money in the house had weakened Itzik. It was the blindfold that they had put on his face, and he had no right to let them put it on him. Without the blindfold, he would have been ready to fight. With it, he was only ready to die." In other words, Itzik was only vulnerable because he was involved in making money, and Finkelstein vows that this will never be him because he does it honestly and his conscience is clean. Now, Arthur Miller's story about Finkelstein was historically false and very cruel. Jews had only been invited into Poland, and they were only protected by the barons to serve in trade and commerce, and they would never have survived otherwise. It was an indispensable function of the Jews, and of course not only in Poland. The condemnation of Itzik for being blinded by money is plunked into the novel like a Marxist commercial that is extraneous to the rest of the action to sell the product. So what was going on here? Why write novels against anti-Semitism that simultaneously vilify the Jews? Well, if you read Karl Marx, then you will understand exactly why. Because, of course, Marx said, what is the worldly religion of the Jews? Huckstering. And what is the worldly god of the Jews? Money. Well then, Miller's inserted story about Itzik's being blinded by money was a condemnation of Jewish capitalists and middlemen who would be eliminated in the socialist economy of an international proletariat. And the professor in Gentleman's Agreement makes a similar case against Zionism. And these were ideas that were not held just by Hobson and by Miller. They were ideas that were held by thousands of Jews and fellow Americans who sincerely believed that the socialist or communist international was the right way to save the Jews and humankind. Poor Jews were legitimate, but Jewish wealth was corrupt. Victim Jews were to be defended, of course, but the Jews reclaiming sovereignty in the land of Israel were as bad as German nationalists. Yiddish was a nice, nostalgic link to the immigrant past and to the dead Jews of Europe, but not Hebrew, the language of Judaism and the Jewish future in Israel. In the Soviet Union, of course, Hebrew and Zionism were forbidden, and their adherents were sent to the Gulag. In America, the same Soviet ideas made persuasive bestsellers. So, listen, this is not intended by me as cultural history and certainly not as literary analysis, but it's to suggest that attacking fascist-style anti-Semitism and discrimination was sometimes an excuse for anti-Zionism, the communist form of anti-Semitism. And there is more to consider, anyway. By equating anti-Semitism with fascism, Holocaust emphasis that began in the 1970s inadvertently gave a free pass to communist and Islamist anti-Zionism that were already in full display and growing by the time those memorials and curricula were established. The conflation of Holocaust with right-wing anti-Semitism opposed white supremacists, but it omitted the Mufti of Jerusalem, Haj Amin al-Husseini, who had already joined Hitler in Germany and ignited the regional jihad that has never stopped since. Holocaust education did nothing to warn against, much less to prevent the actual war that was being waged against Israel and the Jews worldwide. And meanwhile, the biological and ideological descendants of those post-war communists and their fellow travelers are the current Jews for Peace and the professors who inspire the pro-Palestinian encampments. Those who shout the loudest about the neo-Nazis marching in Charlottesville also oppose America's arms shipment to Israel. And so now we are ready for the meat of our subject. Who brought anti-Semitism back to America? The short answer is the Arab-Muslim war against the Jews. But I began by describing who led it back under these new auspices. I will try to summarize the situation, the second part, of which you are all very familiar. I would say terminology matters. There is, to my mind, no such thing as the Arab-Israel conflict, any more than there was a German-Jewish conflict when Nazism launched its final solution. When the Arab League attacked Israel in 1948, it launched against the Jews the most asymmetrical war ever fought. There are over 500 million Arabs in 21 countries, covering more territory than the United States, with ties to 1.2 billion Muslims worldwide. The targeted Jews are fewer worldwide than they were in 1939. And the name of the Jewish state, Israel, as you know, does not fit into any world map. A unilateral war that is so preposterously lopsided can only be stopped at the will of the aggressor, which may yet make this the longest war in history, as Arab and Muslim countries threaten to move in and out of treaties at their convenience. The lopsidedness is itself a function of the opposite political goals: Islam's idea of universal expansion as against the Jewish idea of self-improvement within a small, specific land. You understand that this is by no means to say that this is true of all factions of Islam and of all Muslims, but what matters are the leaders, and this has been true of the leaders and of their thinking, and of very many religious Muslims, and of those whom we call Islamists for good reason. And even greater now than the Arab-Muslim demographic, territorial, and resource advantages is this, in this war that I'm describing, is the political advantage that Arab leaders gained by keeping the Palestinian Arabs perpetual refugees, perpetual claimants to the Jewish state. Of all the disadvantages that we face as a people in the conflict, the moral political inversion created by the allegedly homeless Arabs is by far the most lethal. In truth, by opposing the immediate and gradual resettlement of the Palestinians who left in 1948, Arab leaders, they actually committed a double crime. A crime against the Jews by refusing to coexist with the children of Abraham, and a crime against their fellow Arabs by insisting that they remain forever homeless. The Palestinians rightly complain that they are victims, exclusively victims of their fellow Arabs. When Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar deliberately turned the population of Gaza into civilian casualties by situating the terrorist network inside the most protected institutions like hospitals and schools, he was doing just what Arab leaders had done to the Arabs of Palestine, and for similar political effect. In each case, Arab leaders blamed the Jews for the misery that they themselves were deliberately causing their co-religionists in order to maintain the ostensible evidence of Jewish aggression. The Palestinians never create effective self-government, never look for accommodation with Jordan, that is Palestine, and keep electing terrorist leaders because they realize that if they were ever to undertake productive self-rule, there would be no further excuse for war against Israel. They would lose all usefulness to the leaders who support them, and they would themselves probably become targets of other terrorist groups. Antisemitism in all its forms holds Jews responsible for the aggression against them. But never before has the libel been developed on such a scale. One can still see the Palestinian refugee camps almost 8 decades later, and now the bombed-out buildings of Gaza and the women and children bearing witness to their tragedy. All it takes to blame the Jews for Arab crime is for Israel to keep thriving and for the Palestinians to keep claiming that Jews thrive at their expense. And now, do you see how this also corresponds to the accusation that American wealth disadvantages the impoverished third world, and to the now popular critical race theory that blames world injustice on white supremacy? that accuses whites of stealing from other races and claims that capitalism keeps white racism in power, and so on. It's exactly the same inversion, the same phenomenon, but leveled at the Jews, who are really one of the smallest people with by far one of the largest images and negative images that has accumulated over time. So Arab anti-Zionism, the organization of politics against the Jews, began as a domestic regional strategy. But by the 1970s, Muslim rulers began to export their anti-Zionism to the democratic West, and they did it with communist help. After losing the military conflicts very badly in 1967 and 1973, they shifted their political tactics from right to left. Right being, we will drive you into the sea, to you, colonizer, imperialist, oppressor Jews, have displaced the suffering Palestinians. Already allied with the Soviet Union, in 1975, the combined Soviet-Arab voting blocs succeeded in passing United Nations General Assembly Resolution 3379, which determines that Zionism is a form of racism and racial discrimination, thereby condemning the national ideology and the very existence of the Jewish state. Now, I personally consider that the turning point and the blackest day since 1945, and not only for Jews. Then US Ambassador to the United Nations, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, knew it and said so. There will be time enough, he said, to contemplate the harm that this act will have done the United Nations. Historians will do that for us, and it is sufficient for the moment only to note the following fact. A great evil has been loosed upon the world. The abomination of anti-Semitism has been given the appearance of international sanction, evil enough in itself, but more ominous by far is the realization that now presses upon us, the realization that if there were no General Assembly, this could never have happened. In other words, the organization that was meant to make the world more secure had become the instrument of evil, the bima, the pulpit of anti-Zionism, an anti-Western coalition uniting anti-democratic factions against the Jews had been given the legitimacy, and had been given that legitimacy in the forum of the family of nations. Now, this was far more than a resolution. And the fact that it was repealed 15 years later had no effect whatsoever on its spread. The anti-Jewish ideology was institutionalized through the United Nations agencies, like the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East, that is UNRWA, which, quote, supports the relief and human development of Palestinians who fled or were expelled during the Nakba, the 1948 Palestine War, and subsequent conflicts, as well as their descendants, including legally adopted children. Now, naturally, many of those employees were going to become allied with the anti-Israel terrorists. After all, they'll only be employed as long as the Palestinians remain helpless refugees. And that is the perfectly logical consequence of the UN position. Hillel Neuer, who is the remarkable director of UN Watch, says that these people are not the firefighters, they are the arsonists. UNRWA is not a bystander, but an enabler of the war against Israel. Now, far from staying at the United Nations, believe me, I am on topic somehow, far from staying at the United Nations and its constituent agencies, this infamy became the basis of Arab Muslim propaganda exported through graduate students and professors and diplomatic envoys who used American freedoms to import jihadism into America. Arab countries, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates heavily funded the teaching of anti-Zionism that morphed with grievance movements that were just ready and waiting. And here, the first part of my talk joins the second. The anti-Zionists of the left with the anti-Zionists of Islamism. Since the 1960s, the anti-war movement had defined the USA as the aggressor nation that napalmed villagers in Vietnam. This snowballed into a massive grievance coalition that embraces black radicals who claim that America was built on slavery, radical socialists who define economic prosperity as greed, radical feminists who denounce a misogynistic patriarchy, anti-colonialists who target white supremacy, and others. This intersectional coalition grew in the academy and the media and in Congress, but it took the Palestinians with their Israel apartheid slogans to give it a keffiyeh uniform and an Islamist flag. The intersectional anti-democratic coalition, anchored in the universities and the elite media, promoted the same politics of blame that had energized so many depraved movements in the past, and this time against the vulnerable nation with that most inflated negative image. Melanie Phillips, based in England and Israel, is right when she says, the tsunami of Jew hatred that we're living through has left many in a state of stunned disbelief. And when she adds, how can so many subscribe to the insane obsession and blood libels of the past? How can so many in the West have simply lost their minds like this? Well, I believe that the first obligation we have is not to scream Gewalt, as Jews once cried in despair, but really to answer that question. Anti-Semitism changed when the Jews changed. Politics against the Jews in diaspora turned into anti-Zionism when Jews began reclaiming their homeland. Anti-Zionism despises the Jewish, Judeo-Christian, and democratic civilization that Israel happens to represent. The snowballing coalition of grievance in this country latched onto Palestinian libel and will keep feeding that hateful inversion until it is defeated here and abroad, every bit as soundly as the fascists were defeated in the Second World War. Now, many of you know this, and we all intend to stop that jihadist assault before it requires a world war. Jews are now a sovereign people. Israel is not contingent. It is not provisional, and it owes the Arabs nothing but the demand for coexistence. Until then, we and our fellow Americans have to match the Israelis in courage in every way that we can, politically and in the world of ideas. The war against Israel and America is never aimed at how bad we are, but at how good we are, how generous, creative, accommodating, eager to exist, and improve the lives of those among whom we live. Jews are like Americans who are also resented for trying to extend the benefits of democracy to others. I said recently that we Jews are the blue and white in the red, white, and blue, which makes us doubly responsible for defending the Jewish homeland and this remarkable republic. What others mistake for dual loyalty is doubled loyalty. You know, it sometimes seems to me as if America, or parts of America, seem to be saying, listen, we came to save you Jews in the last World War, and now we expect Israel to save America from the Islamists and their despotic supporters. I think that the pressure on Israel is huge, and I fear that it is in danger of becoming too great. Israel cannot take on the burden of being America, and so it's our job to mobilize America to be America and to take its role in this conflict seriously. So anti-Semitism went into retreat when this country was strong militarily and morally confident. And Jews, we can only contribute to that moral confidence by standing up for ourselves, for the Jewish people, and for the Jewish state. And I would say that this community is as good a starting place as any. Thank you.